Question number 5.
If we're ready.
Robertson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Finance. Is ASB economist Kim Mundy correct when she said last week, quote, "While headline growth appears reasonable and encouraging, underlying per capita income growth remains flat and highlights New Zealand's economic vulnerabilities going forward"?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, and I disagree with the ASB economist. New Zealand, with the exception of, I think, one quarter subject to revision, has had a long period of consistent GDP growth. That has delivered income increases of 2 to 3% to households at a time when inflation is low. Job growth has been pretty strong, and whatever other measures the member might want to apply, that actually shows that the economy is on a sustainable track of moderate growth.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
What has been the percentage per capita GDP growth in the last year based on the Statistics New Zealand figures released last week?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, I can't tell the member that. What I can point him to is the forecasts by ASB economist Kim Mundy, which show per capita GDP to go to annual growth of 2% over the next 2 years, which looks pretty robust, particularly when you've got a fast-growing population.
Supplementary question, Mr.
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
Could the failure of the government to lift exports as a percentage of GDP and that they are nowhere near their own target of 40% of GDP be one of the economic vulnerabilities Ms Mundy is talking about?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, no. In fact, recent performance in the export sector shows exactly why the New Zealand economy is less vulnerable than that member wants it to be. In a year when dairy exports dropped, I think, 3 billion, total exports actually went up by 5 billion, 2 billion, which shows that the rest of the export sector is surprisingly strong. And it's not correct, as that member has said, that New Zealand is far too reliant on dairy.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
When independent commentators are calling per-person growth sluggish and feeble, doesn't he think he should pay a little bit more attention to that instead of giving patronising answers?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, I thought they were referring to the opposition spokesman on finance, but there you go.
Is that it? Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question. Order. Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
Is importing growth rather than creating it, as the Manufacturers and Exporters Association put it last week, one of the economic vulnerabilities facing New Zealand?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, no. And I don't know quite what they mean. I mean, the fact is that a small open economy like this has to be part of global supply chains, whether it's goods or services or, in fact, people, as illustrated by the pretty strong migration at the moment. We need to be more integrated with the world, so importing what we need to add value and therefore grow would seem to be perfectly legitimate way of growing, as much as the bright idea that comes out of some young person who's setting out with a start-up that doesn't import anything. Both are legitimate sources of growth.
Supplementary question, Mr.
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
At what point is the Minister going to wake up from his 8-year slumber and work out that the economy hasn't diversified sufficiently, that we are still reliant on dairy prices, and that we actually haven't got an economy growing per person based on productivity?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the economy's had, relative to others, a dream run. And in that sense, we'd be happy for that to continue. The member seems to be trying to make a point about a low per capita number from a year when dairy income slumped dramatically and we had record high migration. Of course, in that circumstance, for 1 year, per capita growth will be a bit lower. But as the economist he quotes, has set out in the ASB graph, per capita incomes are likely to return to annual growth of 2% over the next 2 years. We'll wait and see.
Question number 6.